The third supply truck arrived at 2:11 a.m. during the whiteout. I remember standing inside the fuel station control room, watching its headlights emerge slowly through the Arctic storm beyond the reinforced windows. Snow hammered the building hard enough to blur the floodlights surrounding the depot while radio towers vanished and reappeared beneath sheets of blowing ice outside. According to the logistics schedule, no deliveries were supposed to reach us for another 4 days. Yet the truck rolled silently across the frozen yard and stopped beside Pump 3 exactly where the previous two had parked earlier that night. No engine noise. No tire chains rattling against ice. Just a dark transport vehicle sitting motionless beneath the storm while fresh snow buried its tracks almost immediately after arrival. Then the station radio crackled softly beside me. "Do not approach the cab," a woman whispered through heavy static. I recognized the voice instantly. Emily Ross, the previous fuel station supervisor, who disappeared during a blizzard 8 months earlier. Before I could answer, one of the yard cameras zoomed automatically toward the truck. The trailer doors were already open. Empty. Empty. No fuel containers. No equipment. Nothing. Then, movement appeared inside the driver's cabin. A figure slowly leaned forward behind the windshield. Wearing my cold weather gear. Using my face. 3 nights earlier. I took the position at North Point Fuel Station because I had finally reached the stage of my life where isolation felt easier than disappointment. My name is Ethan Walker. 38 years old. Former industrial electrician. Recently divorced. Financially unstable. Carrying enough unresolved guilt to make sleeping through the night feel like a luxury instead of a biological necessity. 2 years earlier, my younger brother Liam died during an offshore platform accident in the Beaufort Sea after a maintenance failure neither of us should have signed off on. Official investigations blamed equipment defects. Corporate reports blamed weather conditions. But Liam had called me 3 times the night before the accident, asking me to double-check a pressure relay I was too exhausted to inspect properly. I ignored the calls. Told myself I would deal with it after getting some sleep. By morning, the platform was burning. G and my brother was gone. Since then, every job felt temporary. Every city felt crowded. Every conversation felt like something I was pretending to participate in. So when a logistics company offered 6 months managing an Arctic fuel station hundreds of miles from the nearest town, I accepted without negotiating the salary. I wanted distance. The station was willing to provide it. North Point sat on a frozen stretch of coastline above the Arctic Circle, where winter consumed nearly everything for most of the year. The facility itself consisted of a handful of steel buildings connected by enclosed walkways, several fuel storage tanks buried beneath snowdrifts, a maintenance garage, and a communications tower rising into the endless darkness overhead. During summer, supply ships occasionally reached the station through thawed channels. During winter, deliveries arrived exclusively by heavy transport trucks crossing ice roads that only existed for a few months each year. The landscape surrounding the station looked less like Earth and more like another planet entirely. Endless white horizons disappearing beneath storms. Frozen sea ice stretching toward darkness. Winds powerful enough to erase vehicle tracks within minutes. Some nights, the isolation felt so complete it became physically uncomfortable. Not because the station was quiet, but because it felt detached from ordinary reality. Like the rest of the world had simply stopped existing beyond the snow. The station supervisor, a tired logistics coordinator named Richard Hale, spent my first evening showing me around before catching the last outbound transport south. Most of the responsibilities sounded simple. Monitor fuel reserves. Maintain pump operations. Log incoming deliveries. Keep the generators functioning. Standard remote infrastructure work. Then he handed me a binder labeled Winter Operating Procedure, S, and the atmosphere changed immediately. The first rule sounded practical enough. Never leave the station alone during whiteout conditions. Never disable the perimeter floodlights after sunset. Always verify delivery manifests before opening storage bays. But the latter instructions became increasingly strange. If an unscheduled supply truck arrives between midnight and dawn, do not approach until sunrise. Never inspect vehicle cabins during a storm. If multiple trucks arrive carrying identical unit numbers, lock the maintenance garage and remain inside the control room until radio confirmation arrives. And finally, printed in bold across the last page, if the trailer is empty, do not ask what was delivered. At first, I assumed the procedures were some combination of Arctic superstition and bureaucratic nonsense developed by workers spending too much time isolated from civilization. Remote stations always develop myths eventually. The human brain hates empty places. Give enough people darkness, exhaustion, and bad weather, and they'll invent patterns out of almost anything. Richard didn't seem interested in explaining the rules anyway. Every time I asked about specific instructions, he changed the subject or redirected the conversation toward equipment maintenance schedules. Only once did he hesitate. We were standing inside the communications room watching snow sweep across the floodlit yard outside when I asked about the previous station supervisor, Emily Ross. According to company records, she had disappeared 8 months earlier during a blizzard. Richard stared through the window for several seconds before answering. "Emily stopped following the logs," he said quietly. "After that, the logs started following her." Then he immediately returned to discussing fuel inventories as if the sentence never happened. After Richard left, darkness settled completely across North Point. Not an ordinary night. Arctic winter darkness. The kind that feels permanent. By midnight, the station stood alone beneath violent wind while snow hammered against steel walls, and communication towers groaned softly somewhere beyond the floodlights. I spent the first few hours reviewing maintenance reports and delivery schedules inside the control room while generators vibrated steadily beneath the floor. Everything seemed normal until I began comparing inventory logs from previous months. That was when I noticed something strange. Certain entries appeared impossible. Deliveries recorded without corresponding manifests. Fuel quantities are changing without withdrawals. Entire supply shipments arriving during storms severe enough to shut down all ice road transport. Then I reached the final report signed by Emily Ross before her disappearance. The last line wasn't inventory data. It wasn't even operational information. It was a handwritten note squeezed into the bottom margin of the page. "The trucks are arriving emptier every week." For the first few days, the strange procedures felt less like warnings and more like relics left behind by people who had spent too many winters trapped inside steel buildings surrounded by darkness. Isolation changes workers at remote stations. Everyone knows that. The human brain was never designed to spend months staring across frozen horizons where weather can erase entire landscapes overnight. So when I found unusual notes hidden inside delivery logs or discovered inventory reports containing impossible timestamps, I filed them mentally beside ghost stories and Arctic folklore. Most of my shifts settled into a predictable routine. Every evening, I inspected the pumps, checked generator output, monitored fuel reserves, and reviewed delivery schedules before midnight. Outside, the world remained buried beneath constant darkness illuminated only by the station floodlights reflecting off endless snowdrifts. Sometimes the northern lights drifted across the sky like silent rivers of green fire. Other nights, blizzard swallowed everything beyond the perimeter fence until the station seemed to float alone inside a white void. The supply deliveries arrived twice a week during clear weather conditions. Massive transport trucks crossed the ice roads from distribution hubs farther south, each carrying fuel drums, maintenance equipment, food supplies, and replacement parts. Most drivers stayed less than 20 minutes before continuing toward other remote facilities scattered across the Arctic coast. They all looked exhausted. Weather-beaten faces. Minimal conversation. Men who spent most of their lives navigating roads that disappeared every spring beneath melting ice. Yet one detail kept bothering me. Every driver reacted strangely when I mentioned Emily Ross. Some pretended not to hear the question. Others changed the subject immediately. One older driver simply stared toward the fuel tanks outside before quietly saying, "She kept counting what wasn't there." Then he refused to elaborate further. At the time, I assumed it was grief. Remote stations become small communities eventually. Disappearances hit harder when there are only a few dozen people spread across hundreds of miles of frozen wilderness. 3 nights into the assignment, I experienced the first genuinely strange incident. Around 1:20 a.m., while reviewing inventory reports inside the control room, the station radio crackled softly through a burst of static. Nothing unusual about that. Storm interference disrupted communications constantly. But then a voice emerged through the noise. Female. Come. Professional. Truck arrival scheduled in 41 minutes, she said clearly before the transmission cut out completely. My stomach tightened immediately because the voice sounded familiar. I spent several seconds trying to place it before realizing why. It matched Emily Ross perfectly. I had heard archived safety recordings narrated by her earlier that week. Same cadence. Same slight rasp beneath certain words. Rationally, there were explanations. Old recordings accidentally routed through the system. Signal overlap from archived broadcasts. Yet when I checked the delivery schedules afterward, no trucks were expected until the following afternoon. Exactly 41 minutes later, however, floodlights illuminated movement near the station perimeter. A transport truck emerged from the darkness beyond the snowfield and rolled slowly toward the fuel yard. The vehicle itself looked ordinary enough. Standard Arctic freight transport. Company markings. Operational headlights. Tire chains grind softly against packed ice. Everything appeared normal except for the timing. No driver had radioed ahead. No delivery existed on the schedule. And according to weather reports, the southern ice road had been closed for nearly 6 hours because of storm conditions. I considered contacting logistics headquarters before remembering one of the station rules. If an unscheduled truck arrives between midnight and dawn, do not approach until sunrise. The instruction felt ridiculous standing there in the control room watching an apparently normal supply vehicle park beside Pump 3. Eventually, I convinced myself there had been a scheduling error. Nothing more. The truck remained motionless beneath the floodlights for the rest of the night while snow accumulated across the cab and trailer. The end sometime shortly before dawn, I glanced away from the window for perhaps 30 seconds to answer a routine systems alert. When I looked back, the truck was gone. No departure recorded on the cameras. No tire tracks leaving the yard. Just empty snow reflecting pale morning light. The following day brought another oddity. While conducting inventory inspections inside the storage warehouse, I discovered a pallet of fuel additives stacked neatly beside the eastern wall. The shipment appeared brand new. Factory packaging. Proper labels. Nothing unusual except for one detail. According to station records, the additives had never been delivered. No manifests. No receiving logs. No inventory adjustments. The pallet simply existed now, despite no documentation proving it ever arrived. I spent nearly an hour checking records before finding a handwritten note tucked between older supply manifests. The handwriting belonged to Emily Ross. "Do not count deliveries after sunrise," the note read. "The inventory always remembers more than the manifests." I stared at the sentence for several seconds before laughing quietly to myself. It sounded exactly like the sort of cryptic nonsense isolated workers write when boredom starts eroding common sense. Still, I folded the note into my pocket instead of throwing it away. For reasons I couldn't explain, the words lingered in my thoughts long after the shift ended. And that night, as another Arctic storm gathered beyond the station lights, I noticed something unsettling in the latest inventory report. The fuel additive pallet had already been listed in station records 3 days before I arrived. The rule I ended up breaking wasn't one of the dramatic ones. Not at first. I didn't go chasing shadows through a blizzard or disable the floodlights during a storm. I simply decided to verify a discrepancy in the station records because that's what I'd spent most of my career doing. Industrial systems fail when people stop questioning inconsistencies. Equipment doesn't care about superstition. Fuel inventories don't rewrite themselves. Deliveries don't magically appear inside warehouses. Somewhere beneath all the strange notes and contradictory reports, there had to be an explanation grounded in logistics and paperwork. So when another unscheduled truck arrived just after 1 a.m. 3 nights later and parked beneath the floodlights beside Pump 3, I made a decision that felt entirely reasonable at the time. Instead of waiting until sunrise like the operating procedures demanded, I decided to inspect the delivery manifests immediately. The storm outside wasn't particularly severe. Visibility remained decent beneath the floodlights, and the truck itself appeared completely ordinary. I watched it through the control room windows for nearly 20 minutes before finally grabbing my cold weather gear and heading toward the yard. The moment I stepped outside, the Arctic wind hit me hard enough to steal my breath. Snow drifted across the frozen ground while the transport vehicle sat motionless beneath layers of accumulating ice. No engine noise. No exhaust plume rising from the stack. That detail should have bothered me more than it did. Temperatures were low enough that any recently arrived vehicle should have been producing visible heat. Instead, the truck looked abandoned. Dead. It had been sitting there for days rather than minutes. Still, I continued across the yard until I reached the driver's side door. The cab windows were coated with frost from the inside. No driver. No footprints around the vehicle. No signs anyone had exited. At first, that actually made me feel better. If nobody was there, then the mystery probably involved scheduling errors rather than anything stranger. I circled toward the trailer and checked the manifest container attached beside the rear doors. Empty. No paperwork. No receiving documents. Nothing. Then I remembered another instruction from the station binder. Never inspect vehicle cabins during a storm. Standing there beside the truck, surrounded by darkness and blowing snow, the rule suddenly felt absurd. What exactly was I supposed to find inside? Ghosts? Missing supervisors? Arctic folklore hiding behind the steering wheel? Before common sense could reassert itself, I climbed onto the running board and looked through the driver's window. The cab was occupied. Not by a person. By evidence. Stacks of maintenance logs covered the passenger seat from floor to ceiling. Hundreds of pages bound in weatherproof folders identical to the ones stored inside the station archives. Some looked decades old. Others appeared brand new. Every folder carried North Point fuel station markings across the cover. My stomach tightened slightly because none of that should have been there. Logistics trucks didn't transport station records. Yet the real problem wasn't the documents themselves. It was the dates printed on the visible labels. Some originated years in the future. Others were dated before the facility had even been constructed. I stared through the glass for several seconds, trying to process what I was seeing. Then something caught my eye near the bottom of the stack. One folder sat partially open. Across the exposed page, written in familiar handwriting, was my name. That should have been enough to send me back inside. Instead, curiosity won. I returned to the station, retrieved a lockbox key, and came back to the truck with every intention of opening the cab. Looking back now, I think part of me already knew I wasn't acting rationally anymore. Isolation does that. It slowly convinces you that unanswered questions are more dangerous than obvious warnings. The driver's door opened surprisingly easily despite the cold. No alarm. No resistance. Just a soft metallic click disappearing beneath the wind. Inside, the maintenance folders remained exactly where I had seen them. I grabbed the one carrying my name and flipped it open immediately. The first page was a routine station report. Generator readings. Fuel levels. Weather conditions. Ordinary operational information. Except the date sat nearly 3 months in the future. And the report was signed by me. Not a similar name. Not a clerical error. My exact signature appeared at the bottom of the page beside a handwritten note. Truck 4 arrived empty again. Nothing terrible happened after that. No voices. No apparitions. No impossible events erupting from the darkness around the station. In fact, I felt strangely relieved while walking back toward the control room carrying the folder beneath my arm. The entire experience suddenly seemed solvable. Maybe someone was running an elaborate prank. Maybe the archives contained corrupted training materials. Maybe Emily Ross had suffered some kind of psychological breakdown that infected the station culture afterward. All explanations sounded more reasonable than what the evidence appeared to suggest. I even laughed at myself while reviewing the future-dated reports later that night. Then I reached the final page in the folder. Unlike the others, it wasn't operational data. Just a single handwritten sentence spanning the center of an otherwise blank sheet. The handwriting matched my own perfectly. You opened the cab earlier than I did. After opening the truck cab, the station stopped feeling like a workplace and started feeling like something that was actively responding to me. Not immediately. The change unfolded slowly enough that I spent almost 2 days convincing myself nothing had actually happened. The future-dated maintenance folder remained locked inside my office desk. The truck disappeared before sunrise, just like the others. The generators continued running. Fuel levels remained stable. Yet subtle inconsistencies began appearing everywhere afterward. Inventory reports no longer matched physical stock counts. Cameras recorded trucks entering the yard hours before they appeared outside. Radio messages arrived referencing conversations that hadn't happened yet. Most disturbing of all, the maintenance logs started changing while I was actively reading them. Entire entries rewrote themselves between page turns. Equipment failures appeared before the system malfunctioned. Repair records documented tasks I hadn't completed yet. Every change seemed minor in isolation, but together they created a growing sense that the station was no longer recording events. It was anticipating them. The radio anomalies escalated first. Around midnight each evening, static began bleeding through every communications channel regardless of weather conditions. At first, the interference sounded ordinary enough. Atmospheric distortion. Solar activity. The kind of noise remote Arctic stations deal with constantly. Then voices started emerging beneath it. Not random transmissions. Conversations. Some belonged to delivery drivers discussing routes that didn't exist on current maps. Others sounded like station personnel performing maintenance tasks in areas of the facility that had been sealed for years. One transmission kept repeating almost every night around 1:17 a.m. A woman calmly reading inventory figures over the radio while someone else recorded them. The voice belonged to Emily Ross. I confirmed that after comparing the recordings to archived safety briefings stored in the station database. The strange part wasn't hearing Emily. The strange part was the dates she referenced. Fuel quantities from future reports. Equipment numbers were assigned months later. Entire shipments that hadn't arrived yet. It sounded less like a recording and more like a live conversation happening somewhere beyond the station's timeline. 3 nights after opening the truck, I discovered something worse. The security cameras had started documenting events before they occurred. I noticed it accidentally while reviewing perimeter footage after another unscheduled truck appeared near Pump 3. One camera showed the vehicle arriving at 1:42 a.m. exactly as expected. Another camera covering the same section of yard recorded the truck parked in position nearly 20 minutes earlier. At first, I assumed the system clocks had drifted out of synchronization. Then I noticed a figure standing beside the vehicle in the earlier recording. Me. Wearing my station gear. Walking around the truck and inspecting the cab. The footage timestamp placed the event 18 minutes in the future. Yet I was watching it happen from the control room in real time. My stomach tightened as I stared at the screen. Then, almost mechanically, I found myself leaving the control room, crossing the yard, and performing the exact actions already shown in the footage. Same route. Same movements. Same pause beside the driver's door. When I returned to the station afterward, the recording matched perfectly. Every second. Every gesture. It felt less like surveillance and more like instructions. The maintenance systems followed next. Equipment failures started appearing in logs before the machinery malfunctioned physically. One report documented a generator coolant leak 6 hours before any pressure changes registered on the sensors. Another predicted a communications relay outage nearly a full day before it occurred. At first, I appreciated the apparent efficiency. Preventive maintenance became easy when the logs essentially told me what would happen in advance. Then the predictions became personal. One evening, I opened a routine service report and found an entry documenting a conversation I hadn't had yet. The report described me arguing with Richard Hale over the radio about an incoming delivery. It included exact dialogue, exact timestamps. 20 minutes later, Richard called unexpectedly from a logistics hub farther south, and the conversation unfolded word for word exactly as the report described. By the time the transmission ended, I was physically shaking. The station logs weren't forecasting mechanical failures anymore. They were recording future events as if they had already happened. Then Truck 4 arrived again. The same vehicle number. Same trailer. Same arrival time. 2:11 a.m. A severe whiteout had settled over North Point by then, reducing visibility beyond the floodlights to almost nothing. Through the storm, I watched the truck emerge slowly from the darkness and stop beside Pump 3 exactly where it always parked. Something felt wrong immediately. Not because of the vehicle itself. Because I already knew what the maintenance logs would say before opening them. My hands trembled while retrieving the latest report from the printer. The page was still warm. Fresh ink. Current timestamp. The entry consisted of only one sentence. Truck 4 arrives empty because it is delivering what hasn't happened yet. As I stared at the words, The station radio crackled softly through waves of static. Emily's voice emerged clearly enough that for a moment it sounded like she was standing directly behind me. "Stop reading the newer logs, Ethan," she whispered. Then, after a long pause, "They started writing us back." After Emily's warning came through the radio, I stopped trusting the station records completely. The problem was that I still couldn't stop reading them. Human beings have a dangerous relationship with information. Once you learn something that appears to know the future, curiosity becomes stronger than self-preservation. For the next 2 days, I locked myself inside the control room reviewing every maintenance archive North Point possessed. Decades of delivery manifests, fuel inventories, equipment reports, and supervisor notes stretching back to the station's construction. At first, the records looked ordinary. Then patterns started emerging. Missing pages. Rewritten dates. Entire months where every report was signed by people who officially left the station years earlier. More disturbingly, several employees seemed to disappear from the records entirely after certain winters. Their names simply stopped appearing. No transfer documents. No termination reports. No explanations. Just sudden absences buried beneath administrative paperwork. The deeper I dug, the clearer one fact became. Emily Ross wasn't the first supervisor to leave strange warnings inside the logs. I eventually found the hidden archive by accident. North Point maintained an older server disconnected from the primary network and buried beneath the communications tower's basement. According to station schematics, the room shouldn't have existed anymore. Yet a maintenance corridor behind the backup generators led directly to a steel door sealed beneath layers of dust and old warning labels. Inside sat rows of obsolete data storage equipment humming softly beneath emergency lighting. The archive contained thousands of reports never been transferred into the official company systems. Most were classified as corrupted files. When I started opening them, I immediately understood why. They weren't corrupted. They were impossible. Inventory logs describing deliveries that arrived years before the roads were built. Maintenance reports documenting equipment failures decades into the future. Entire conversations recorded between station supervisors separated by generations. One file contained a discussion between Emily Ross and a manager who had disappeared in 1994. Another included references to me nearly 18 months before I accepted the position. Every document carried the same notation somewhere in the margins. The empty trucks are not transporting fuel. They are transporting events. At first, I dismissed it as a metaphor. Then I discovered the delivery recordings. The station archived security footage from every incoming shipment dating back nearly 30 years. Most clips showed exactly what you'd expect. Fuel deliveries. Equipment transfers. Supply runs crossing the ice roads. But certain recordings were different. Unscheduled arrivals. Empty trailers. Missing manifests. Vehicles that appeared briefly before dawn and vanished before sunrise. The trucks were always empty inside. Yet inventory counts changed afterward. Fuel reserves increased. Replacement parts appeared inside warehouses. Maintenance equipment materialized in storage bays. Something was being delivered, just not physically. The most unsettling footage came from 8 months earlier during the blizzard when Emily disappeared. Camera recordings showed her standing beside Truck 4 during a storm, speaking directly into the open trailer while nobody else appeared present. Then she climbed inside. The trailer doors closed. 30 minutes later, the truck drove away. When station personnel opened the trailer after sunrise, it was empty. The final piece came from Emily herself. Hidden inside the server archive was a series of private audio logs recorded during the weeks before her disappearance. At first, they sounded like routine supervisor reports. Equipment updates, weather observations, inventory notes. Then her tone changed. The later recordings carried the exhausted strain of someone trying desperately to document something they barely understood. According to Emily, the trucks weren't arriving from elsewhere geographically. They were arriving from elsewhere chronologically. The maintenance logs weren't predicting events. They were inventorying them. Every future report, every impossible delivery, every rewritten record represented information transported backward through the station systems by the empty trucks. North Point sat on top of an abandoned military communications experiment conducted during the Cold War. The facility originally tested long-range temporal signal transmission through Arctic relay networks. The project failed catastrophically after researchers discovered information could move through the system more easily than matter. Eventually, all our shipments of future data began arriving inside delivery manifests before the events themselves occurred. The trucks became part of the phenomenon afterward. Then I reached Emily's final recording. The file timestamp was corrupted. The audio quality fluctuated violently beneath static. But her voice remained clear enough. If you're hearing this, then Truck 4 already showed you your own reports. That means the station has started integrating you into the inventory. Don't trust the newer logs. Don't trust the cameras. Most importantly, never read a report dated after your disappearance. She paused for several seconds while distant wind echoed somewhere behind the recording. The trucks arrive empty because they're collecting what happens next. Every future event gets transported backward through the system and distributed into the archives. The station isn't predicting us. It's assembling us from information that already arrived. Another pause. Then her voice dropped almost to a whisper. I finally opened the oldest delivery record tonight. The first one. The ship was received before the station was built. Ethan. It listed every supervisor who would ever work here, including you. Static swallowed the recording for a moment. When her voice returned, she sounded terrified for the first time. And beside your name, under final inventory status, it says exactly what it said beside mine. The recording ended. I sat motionless for nearly a minute before opening the oldest archived delivery manifest on the server. The document was dated 11 years before North Point Fuel Station officially existed. Most of the inventory fields were blank. Only one section contained information. A list of names. Every station supervisor. Every maintenance chief. Every communications operator. 30 years of personnel records. Some marked active. Some marked delivered. Some marked missing. Near the bottom of the page, beside Emily Ross's name, the status field read, Received. Beside mine, there was only one word. Pending. After finding the manifest, I stopped thinking about leaving North Point and started thinking about survival in a much narrower sense. The station no longer felt like a remote workplace sitting on frozen coastline above the Arctic Circle. It felt like a machine processing information through people the same way it processed fuel through storage tanks. Every strange event suddenly aligned beneath a horrifying logic. The trucks weren't delivering cargo. The logs weren't predicting outcomes. The entire facility functioned like a distribution network for events that had already occurred somewhere ahead of us. Future maintenance reports arrived because future maintenance had already happened. Inventory records changed because the station remembered receiving information before we physically experienced it. And if Emily's recordings were correct, Every employee eventually became part of the system itself. Not killed. Not erased. Catalogued. Filed away like inventory awaiting transport. That realization settled over me with a strange calmness. Panic requires uncertainty. By then, uncertainty had largely disappeared. I created my own rules the following morning. Never read any maintenance log dated beyond the current day. Never watch security footage longer than 6 hours old. Never open archived manifests between midnight and dawn. Never approach Truck 4 regardless of weather conditions. Most importantly, never confirm information that the station has not physically revealed yet. The last rule became the hardest. Once you've seen evidence of future events, resisting the temptation to verify them becomes almost impossible. Every conversation, every equipment alarm, every delivery schedule carries the possibility of confirmation. Yet I force myself to follow the rules anyway. For a while, they seemed effective. The radio anomalies decreased. The maintenance reports stopped referencing personal events. Even the inventory system stabilized temporarily. North Point almost felt ordinary again beneath the endless darkness and constant Arctic wind. But deep down, I understood the truth. The station wasn't reacting to my behavior. It was adapting. The first sign came from the cameras. One evening around 11 p.m., I noticed something unusual while checking perimeter feeds. The recordings had stopped showing future events entirely. At first, I felt relieved. Then I realized something worse was happening. The cameras had started omitting events instead. Entire sections of footage simply vanished from the timeline. Trucks appeared in the yard without recorded arrivals. Equipment failures occurred without corresponding surveillance data. People crossed hallways without appearing on camera. It was as though the station had decided I could no longer be trusted with predictive information and began withholding it completely. The phenomenon spread quickly afterward. Maintenance reports became shorter. Delivery manifests arrived partially blank. Even the radio transmissions changed. Instead of hearing future conversations, I started hearing fragments of discussions that seemed deliberately interrupted before important details emerged. The system wasn't malfunctioning. It was filtering itself around me. Then the station started writing directly to me. Not through future reports. Current ones. The first message appeared inside a routine generator inspection log. Everything looked normal until the final line. Rule 3 is correct. Do not open archives after midnight. A second note appeared the next day inside a fuel inventory report. Rule 5 will fail first. I nearly convinced myself another employee was playing an elaborate prank until I remembered there were no other employees. North Point remained completely isolated until the next scheduled delivery. The messages continued appearing regardless. Maintenance forms. Communications reports. Weather summaries. Always brief. Always specific to whatever rules I had created. Eventually, why I stopped documenting them altogether because each acknowledgement seemed to encourage more responses. Yet the silence never lasted. The station wanted dialogue. It wanted participation. And every message carried the uncomfortable sensation that something was learning from my attempts to resist it. 3 nights later, the radio woke me at 2:04 a.m. Emily's voice emerged through the control room speakers so clearly that for a moment I thought someone had physically entered the building. "It started reorganizing your inventory," she said calmly. No static. No interference. Just her voice. I grabbed the microphone immediately. "What does that mean?" For the first time since arriving at North Point, she answered directly. It means you're still treating yourself like a person in the records. Then the transmission ended. I spent the next hour searching every system inside the station and trying to understand what she meant. Eventually, I found it buried deep inside the personnel database. My employee profile still existed. Same identification number. Same hiring date. Same credentials. But one field had changed. Status. It no longer reads active. It no longer reads employed. The entry now matched the terminology used throughout the impossible delivery manifests. In transit. That should have terrified me. Instead, what frightened me most was discovering the modification timestamp. The change hadn't occurred that night. It had happened 6 days earlier. 2 days before I ever found the oldest manifest. Before I knew the classification system existed. Before I understood what the station was doing. And beneath the status field sat a note added only minutes before I opened the file. A note that hadn't been there when I first logged into the database. The message consisted of one sentence. Truck 4 arrives tomorrow with your completed record. The next day passed with the slow, unbearable tension of waiting for a medical diagnosis you already know will be terminal. Every clock inside North Point seemed louder. Every generator vibration beneath the floor felt more pronounced. Outside, Arctic darkness pressed against the station windows while snow drifted endlessly across the frozen yard beneath the floodlights. I spent most of the afternoon trying to leave. Not emotionally. Physically. I packed emergency supplies, loaded a tracked utility vehicle, and prepared a route toward the southern logistics hub nearly 80 miles away. Then I discovered something impossible. Every navigation system inside the station showed different distances to the same destination. Some maps listed the hub 80 miles away. Others showed 200. One system displayed no route at all. When I checked archived weather forecasts, they contradicted each other as well. Storm conditions both existed and didn't exist, depending on which report I opened. It felt less like data corruption and more like the station itself refusing to settle on a version of reality where departure remained possible. At 6:14 p.m., Truck 4 appeared on the perimeter cameras. Not arriving. Already there. The vehicle sat beyond the floodlights at the edge of visibility, where blowing snow merged with darkness. No recorded approach. No tire tracks leading toward it. One moment, the yard remained empty. Next, the truck simply occupied space beside the frozen access road. Every camera showed it from a slightly different angle despite being fixed in position. On one feed, the trailer appeared intact. On another, the rear doors hung open, revealing only darkness inside. A third camera showed frost covering the windshield so heavily that the cab looked abandoned. Yet through all the inconsistencies, one detail remained identical. Someone sat behind the steering wheel. Motionless. Waiting. I knew without zooming who it was. The same face from the whiteout 3 nights earlier. My face. Watching the station through the storm. The maintenance logs abandoned subtlety after that. Reports started printing automatically every 20 or 30 minutes despite no active requests. Entire stacks accumulated beside the control room printer. Some described conversations I was currently having with myself. Others documented future actions in increasingly alarming detail. One report recorded me entering the truck at 2:11 a.m. Another described my disappearance from the station archives at 2:26. A third listed fuel inventory adjustments following my departure. Not death. Not an accident. Departure. Every document used the same language that the station reserved for shipments and deliveries. Eventually, I stopped reading them altogether. It didn't matter. New pages continued emerging anyway, sliding from the printer like instructions being distributed through a logistics network. Then one report arrived carrying no operational information whatsoever. Just a transcript. A conversation between Emily Ross and someone identified only as receiving inventory. The final line sat alone at the bottom of the page. Once they understand the manifest, they always try to leave. That's when the truck becomes visible. At exactly 1:58 a.m., every radio inside North Point activated simultaneously. Not static. Not interference. Hundreds of voices. Station supervisors. Drivers. Maintenance workers. Decades of personnel records speak at once through overlapping transmissions. Some recited inventory counts. Others reported weather conditions from years that hadn't happened yet. Many simply repeated names. Long lists of names read aloud over and over beneath the storm. Then the voices gradually synchronized until only one remained. Emily Ross. Come. Exhausted. Close enough to feel physically present inside the control room. Ethan listened carefully. I grabbed the microphone immediately. What is truck for? Several seconds passed before she answered. The final delivery. The room suddenly felt much colder. What does it transport? Another pause. Then her voice cracked for the first time. Whatever's left after the station finishes recording you. Outside, the floodlights flickered violently. For a brief moment, the storm thinned enough for me to see the entire yard clearly. Truck 4 no longer sat beyond the perimeter. It was parked directly beside Pump 3. The trailer doors stood open. Empty. Yet something moved inside anyway. Not a person. Pages. Thousands of loose maintenance reports swirl through the darkness within the trailer like snow trapped inside a tornado. Future logs. Inventory manifests. Personnel files. Entire years of station records spinning endlessly in impossible wind. And standing beside the open trailer beneath the floodlights was the figure from the cameras. My face. My cold weather gear. My posture. Every detail identical except for one thing. He wasn't watching the station anymore. He was watching me through the control room window. Then he slowly raised a maintenance folder and pressed it against the glass of the cab. Even from across the yard, I could read the status line printed across the cover. Ethan Walker. Final inventory report. Received. For several seconds, I couldn't move. The control room stood silent except for the generators vibrating beneath the floor and the endless Arctic wind screaming outside the steel walls. Truck 4 waited beside Pump 3 beneath the floodlights while pages spun endlessly inside the open trailer like a storm made entirely from records and reports. My duplicate remained motionless beside the cab, holding the maintenance folder against the glass. Final inventory report. Received. The station had spent days teaching me to think about myself as data instead of a person. Status fields. Delivery manifests. Inventory classifications. Somehow, with that realization frightened more than anything else. Not because I believed it completely. Because part of me was starting to. Then Emily spoke again through the radio. Don't let it complete the report. Her voice sounded weaker than before. Farther away. Like the transmission itself was struggling to remain connected. The inventory only stabilizes when you accept the classification. I stared at the truck through the window while trying to understand what she meant. Every impossible event at North Point suddenly rearranged itself inside my head. The future logs. The rewritten manifests. The missing personnel records. The station wasn't predicting people. It was documenting them until documentation became reality. Every supervisor who disappeared eventually accepted information delivered through the archives before physically experiencing it. Every employee who became received stopped treating themselves as participants and started treating themselves as entries. The station didn't transport bodies. It transported certainty. And certainly, once fully accepted, it became inventory. For the first time since arriving at North Point, I stopped reading. Not the reports. Everything. I shut down the maintenance printer. Disabled the inventory terminals. Disconnected the archive servers from the network. Then I walked directly into the communications room and powered down every system capable of receiving station records. Screens went black one after another beneath the emergency lighting. The radio transmissions dissolved into silence. Future reports stopped printing. Even the personnel database disappeared as the servers powered off. For several seconds, the station felt strangely ordinary again. Just steel walls, generators, and Arctic darkness. The relief lasted less than a minute. Then the emergency systems activated automatically. Every screen inside North Point came back online. Not rebooted. Restored. As if they had never been turned off at all. The maintenance reports returned immediately. So did the inventory records. New files began appearing across every monitor faster than I could close them. Hundreds of documents. Thousands. Everyone carrying my name somewhere inside. Personnel logs. Weather summaries. Delivery manifests. Entire station histories reorganizing themselves around a single conclusion. The station wasn't reacting to my resistance. It had already archived it. Outside, Truck 4's trailer began unloading. Not cargo. Records. Pages drifted from the darkness inside and scattered across the snow-covered yard beneath the floodlights. Some blew against the windows. Others accumulated around the pumps like drifts. I grabbed one from the floor after it slid beneath the control room door. The document was dated 9 months in the future. Another described repairs performed after the station officially ceased operations. A third carried no operational information whatsoever. Just a transcript of this exact moment. My movements. My thoughts. My attempts to disconnect the systems. Every action is documented before completion. Then I reached the final line. Subject is beginning to recognize the inventory process. The handwriting wasn't mine. It wasn't Emily's either. It belonged to something else entirely. Then I understood what had to change. Every supervisor before me fought the station by challenging the information it delivered. They argued with the reports, investigated the archives, tried escaping the classifications. But all those responses still accepted the station's central assumption that the records described reality. The station depended on recognition, confirmation, acceptance. That was how information became inventory. So instead of confronting Truck 4, I did something no report had predicted. I opened the oldest manifest. The one dated before North Point existed. The one listing every supervisor and employee across 3 decades of station history. Then I took a marker and began crossing names out. Emily Ross. Crossed out. Richard Hale. Crossed out. Every received classification. Every missing status. Every archived employee. One by one. not deleting them, rejecting the inventory. The moment I marked my own name, every light inside the station failed. Total darkness swallowed North Point. Outside, the floodlights vanished. The truck disappeared. The radios went silent. For the first time since arriving above the Arctic Circle, there were no reports. No manifests. No predictions. Only darkness, wind, and the distant sound of something enormous moving across the ice beyond the station walls. Then, somewhere outside in the black Arctic night, a truck horn sounded. Not approaching. Leaving. I don't know how long the darkness lasted after I crossed my name out of the manifest. Minutes. Hours. Maybe longer. Time felt unreliable once the station systems stopped recording it. I sat alone inside the control room listening to Arctic wind batter the walls while emergency lighting remained stubbornly dead throughout the facility. No generators failed. No alarms activated. North Point simply stopped producing information. For the first time since arriving, no maintenance reports were waiting beside the printers. No inventory adjustments. No future logs describing what happened next. The silence felt unnatural after weeks of constant documentation. Like stepping outside after living beside machinery so long you forget what absence sounds like. Then gradually, one system at a time, the station returned. Emergency lights flickered weakly back to life. Generator monitors rebooted. Communications equipment reinitialized. But something fundamental had changed. Every archive server remained empty. Every delivery manifest had vanished. Entire decades of impossible records simply no longer existed anywhere in the system. At sunrise, I went outside. The storm had finally passed. A pale Arctic dawn stretched across endless snowfields while the frozen coastline glowed beneath weak winter light. Truck 4 was gone. So were the pages scattered around the yard. No tire tracks remained beside Pump 3. No evidence that any vehicle had visited the station at all. Yet the absence felt different this time. Before, the trucks disappeared while leaving questions behind. Now they were simply gone. Like a process interrupted before completion. I spent most of that day searching the facility. The hidden archive beneath the communications tower had vanished completely. Not destroyed. Gone. The corridor leading toward it now ended at a solid steel wall, according to the original station blueprints. Emily's recordings disappeared from every storage device. The personnel database no longer listed her as missing. In fact, it didn't list her at all. Entire histories had been quietly erased. Only one thing remained. Folded inside my jacket pocket was the oldest manifest. The names I crossed out were still marked in black ink. The rescue helicopter arrived 2 days later. Officially, severe communications failures had triggered concern after North Point stopped responding to routine check-ins. I didn't argue when the company representatives ordered an immediate evacuation. I didn't mention the trucks. I didn't mention the archives. I certainly didn't explain why every inventory system at the station suddenly contained gaps spanning decades. The investigation lasted months. Engineers blamed software corruption. Historians blamed record migration errors. Executives blamed obsolete infrastructure. Eventually, North Point Fuel Station was permanently decommissioned. The buildings remain there today, according to satellite imagery, slowly disappearing beneath snow and ice along the coast. Nobody staffs the facility anymore. No deliveries arrive. No reports are generated. As far as the world is concerned, the station simply became another failed Arctic project abandoned by budget cuts and weather. I left the North after that. For a while, I convinced myself that destroying the manifest ended whatever process existed beneath the station permanently. Trauma becomes easier to manage when distance separates you from the place where it happened. I found work farther south. Started sleeping better. Drank less. I began answering phone calls again instead of letting them ring endlessly into voicemail. Life gradually reassembled itself into something resembling normal. Then, almost 11 months after leaving North Point, a package arrived at my apartment with no return address. Inside sat a single maintenance folder. Standard station issue. Weatherproof cover. North Point identification markings. No shipping labels. No postage information. My hands started shaking before I even opened it. Deep down, I already knew what waited inside. The folder contained one page. Nothing else. No reports. No inventory data. No classifications. Just a delivery receipt. The date field was blank. The destination field was blank. Only one section contained information. Status. Pending. Beneath it, written in handwriting I recognized immediately from the oldest manifest, sat a final note. Shipment delayed. I barely sleep now. Most nights, I wake around 2:11 a.m., convinced I hear heavy engines idling somewhere beyond my apartment window, despite living in the center of a crowded city. Sometimes, delivery trucks parked at intersections seem familiar in ways I can't explain. Other times, the inventory systems at work display records that vanish when refreshed moments later. But the worst moments happen during snowstorms. That's when ordinary things begin feeling subtly incorrect around me. Shipping manifests listing items before orders are placed. Maintenance schedules documenting repairs before equipment fails. And every once in a while, usually just before dawn, I'll look outside and catch sight of a transport truck parked silently at the edge of visibility beyond falling snow. No headlights. No driver visible through the windshield. Just waiting patiently beneath the storm as if expecting another delivery. And during those moments, I always remember the final sentence hidden inside Emily Ross's last surviving recording. The trucks were never carrying information from the future. They were carrying versions of reality that had already finished happening.